Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Back to Ashes. My name is Phoenix. To the elites, the love comes back to you tenfold. If you are new to the channel and you begin to like what you are hearing, please join us by hitting that subscribe button. Make sure you set your notification bell to all, that way you don't miss a video. With that being said, it is now time to go back to Ashes. So, sit back, relax, kick back, have a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled The Unsolved. Right after this intro, there will be an ad. I'll read the first case, there will be an ad. And after that, there will be no more ads within this video. Disclaimer, some of these cases might contain information that is sensitive to some. Listening discretion is advised. A family's disappearance, a bizarre car crash, and a possible cult connection. What happened to the Burhans Garcia family in 1982? The disappearance of the Burhans Garcia family in 1982 remains a little-known case involving rumors of a cult, an abandoned car, and mysterious sightings months later. Carmen Burhans, her husband Diego, and daughter Barbara vanished after leaving their Los Angeles home on March 15, 1982. A month later, their car was found at the bottom of a mountain gorge 80 miles away, without them inside it. Where did they go? This is an intriguing but obscure mystery. The Burhans Garcia family lived on Division Street in the Los Angeles suburb of Glassell Park. The family consisted of 40-year-old Carmen Burhans, her 28-year-old husband, Diego Garcia. Carmen had her first name, husband, surname when she remarried. 8-year-old Barbara Burhans, Carmen's daughter from her first marriage, and Carmen's mother, Margaret Roman. The two-story house was apparently split into apartments, with Margaret living in the downstairs, or upstairs per some sources, unit. Monday, March 15, 1982, began on a somber note. Margaret went upstairs, or downstairs, to have breakfast with the family and found her daughter sobbing at the kitchen table. Somewhat curiously, she never asked what was wrong. At around noon that same day, Carmen, Diego, and Barbara all got into the family's brown 1977 Toyota Corolla and drove away without saying where they were going or when they would return. Margaret never saw them again and reported them missing soon after. Then, on Sunday, April 25th, a chilling discovery was made about 80 miles north of Glassell Park. At the bottom of a gorge in the San Gabriel Mountains, just off Route 2 near the town of Big Pines, California, the family's brown Toyota was found buried in a snowbank. It was submerged under 5 feet of snow with its roof smashed in. In most cases, this would solve the mystery, a tragic but routine accident. But the discovery of the car only raised more questions. Namely, why none of the 3 occupants were in or near it. In fact, the car contained no blood or signs of foul play. Police theorized that the car was either purposely pushed down the gorge to conceal it, or that a snowplow had accidentally knocked it down there after failing to see it under the heavy snow. It was determined that the stretch of road had been closed since March 16th, the day after the family was last seen. This means the car could only have entered that particular area on Monday, March 15th, the day of the disappearance. But where were Carmen and her family? And why did they, or at least their car, end up in this remote location so far from home with no known reason to be there? At the time of disappearance, Carmen worked for an insurance firm and was the main provider, as Diego was unemployed. Shortly before she vanished, Carmen had converted to the Mormon faith. A few leads came in, but never panned out. In mid-April 1982, a former classmate claimed to have seen Carmen in LA's Eagle Rock Plaza Mall. Someone else reported that Carmen and an elderly individual had purchased flowers at Glendale Adventist Hospital just late that same year. Margaret Roman said her daughter may have become involved in a cult that sacrificed chickens and used candles in its worship. A candle shop owner named Gustavo Rodriguez claimed to have sold Carmen several candles in May, 2 months after she, her husband, and daughter were last seen. A check cashed on March 20th, 5 days after the disappearance, from Carmen's Woodland Hills bank account was made payable to an elderly woman who said she had sold some live chickens to the missing woman. There were even unproven rumors that Carmen was executed for failing to pay back a debt owned by Diego. It was also rumored that the family had left the West Coast entirely and relocated to Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, since Diego was originally from Cuba. But searches in Florida proved fruitless. Diego's stepfather, Pascual Pino, stated that he believed his stepson was a victim of homicide. To this day, no trace of Carmen Burhans, Diego Garcia, or Barbara Burhans has ever been found. Here are some of the lingering questions about this case. What happened to this family? Why was Carmen so upset at the breakfast table that morning? And is it related to the overall case? Why did they travel 80 miles north only to apparently abandon their car, which ended up in a gorge? Is there a link between the cult and these disappearances? Why are all of the alleged sightings of Carmen without Diego or Barbara? While these are lingering questions, no one knows if we will ever find the answers. Scott and Amy Fendel, Alaska siblings, vanished from cabin. Their mother found a pot of boiling water on the stove when she got home, but the children were gone. Children mysteriously vanish. Scott Fendel, 13, and Amy, 8, were dropped off at home by their mother, Margaret, on the evening of September 4th, 1978. As far as she knew, her children were safe and everything appeared to be normal. Yet, when Margaret and her sister Kathy returned to the cabin hours later, they were met by an odd scene. A pot of boiling water on the stove, an open can of tomatoes, and a box of macaroni left on the counter, but no sign of Scott and Amy anywhere. It seemed that Scott had been interrupted in the middle of making one of his favorite meals. But by what? Or whom? No one could say for sure. Over the course of the investigation, and in the absence of solid evidence of any kind, family members would begin implicating one another and making disturbing accusations. What really happened to Scott and Amy Fendel? Scott and Amy Fendel. Scott Curtis Fendel was born on January 23, 1965. 5.5 years later, his younger sister, Amy Lee, was born on August 25, 1970. They share a mother, Margaret, but have two different fathers. Little is known about Scott's biological father, but Margaret married Roger Fendel, Amy's father, when Scott was very young. Those who knew him would remember Scott as a prankster, but also intelligent and mature for his age. He was a kind boy, yet fiercely protective of his younger sister. Additionally, he loved motorcycles and the outdoors. He had even passed a wilderness survival course. Margaret described Amy as a sweet girl who was kind to animals, kind to people. She loved dolls, pretty clothes, and pretty shoes. Contentious divorce. Months before the children went missing, Margaret, who had reportedly developed a drinking habit, and the unfaithful Roger went through a bitter divorce, and he moved to Arizona alone. Scott and Amy were frequently unsupervised after Roger's departure, but Scott, now a teenager, was said to be a responsible babysitter for Amy. The Lupton family, Nancy, Bill, and their 5 children, was the Fandels' nearest neighbors, living roughly 200 yards away in a Quonset hut. Amy and Scott were close friends with the Lupton children and often spent time with them, even walking to school with them every day. Interrupted meal preparation. Margaret's sister Kathy came to live with the Fandels in September of 1978. Scott and Amy were excited to have their aunt there. On the evening of Monday, September 14th, 1978, Margaret, Kathy, Scott, and Amy were at Good Time Charlie's, a local bar and restaurant. The children played arcade games while the women drank beer. Since it was getting late, Margaret dropped off the children at the cabin at approximately 10 p.m. Margaret and Kathy decided to drive to nearby Kenay, about 11 miles northwest of Soldotna, to meet up with a friend who was working there. Scott and Amy went over to the Lupton house and played with their friends. However, Nancy and Bill felt that the kids were being too loud and sent the Fandel children home. A neighbor passing by noticed that the lights were on in the Fandel cabin at around 11:45 p.m. It's worth noting that their cabin didn't have a working lock, leaving them unprotected from potential intruders. A dark and quiet house. Margaret and Kathy were unable to locate their friends in Kenay and instead went to 2 local bars, Larry's Club and the Rainbow Bar. It was after 2 a.m. when they finally arrived back home and found the lights off. This was odd because the kids were afraid of the dark and typically left them on. The strangeness didn't end there. The 2 women saw a pot of boiling water on the stove, as well as an open can of tomatoes and a package of macaroni on the kitchen counter. Scott loved to eat macaroni before going to bed, but why had he abruptly stopped preparing it? It's unclear if Margaret and Kathy looked for the children, as no sources elaborate on this, but they ultimately assumed that Scott and Amy had simply decided to spend the night at the Lupton home. Later that morning, 31-year-old Margaret, a waitress, woke up and went to work. Kathy slept until noon. While at work, Margaret called the school, intending to scold Amy for not stopping by the cabin before leaving to attend class. But, to her surprise, she learned that neither of her children had shown up at school that day. Panicked, Margaret wanted to leave work and search for them, but her boss wouldn't allow her to go before her shift was over. After school, the Lupton children stopped by and asked Kathy where Scott and Amy were. They also revealed that the Fandel children hadn't spent the night over at their house. So, where were they? The Luptons hadn't heard or seen anything suspicious, and nothing else appeared to be missing from the home. Margaret called the Alaska State Troopers and reported Scott and Amy missing at 5:14 p.m. on September 5th. Within a day or two, Margaret attempted to contact her ex-husband Roger to see if he had the children, but couldn't reach him. Instead, she spoke to his family, who said that Roger didn't have the kids and that none of them had any idea where they might be. Investigation yields few clues. Police brought in search dogs from Anchorage and combed through the nearby wooded areas, but found nothing of note. They searched berries as well and also alerted Canadian Mounties to be on the lookout for someone attempting to cross the border with Scott and Amy. Roger flew out of Arizona that weekend and aided in the search. Carnival workers. According to Trooper Sergeant Tom Sumi, investigators decided that a black sedan belonging to two carnival workers had been spotted in the area that night, speeding away from the cabin. This was considered particularly significant as the carnival workers were casual acquaintances of the Fandels, whom Margaret had allowed to spend the night once in late August. However, they claimed to have been near the cabin the night after the kids went missing, and that they'd considered stopping by to visit, but had decided against it and left. The men, who worked for the Alaska State Fair, stated that they'd merely come back to Sterling to pick up their paychecks. The witness also admitted that they may have been mistaken about which night the sighting took place. Ultimately, it appears that authorities eventually stopped looking at the workers as suspects, but the reason for this hasn't been disclosed. Perhaps it was due to a lack of physical evidence linking them to the presumed abduction. It was speculated that someone at Good Time Charlie's might have overheard that the kids were going to be alone and took the opportunity to abduct them. But this has never been proven either. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads, none of which proved to be fruitful. Bullet casings were found outside of the Fandel cabin, but it was unclear if they were old or new, or if they were related in any way to the disappearance of Scott and Amy. Further developments. Margaret herself was viewed with suspicion early on, and her phone was tapped by law enforcement in an effort to see if she'd say anything incriminating, but this apparently went nowhere. However, she now felt unwelcome in the area as some residents clearly thought that she was responsible for whatever happened and made no secret of that belief. Additionally, she was harassed by psychics claiming to know where her son and daughter were. She became depressed and increasingly more dependent on alcohol. All of this led to her decision to move back to Illinois in 1980. Margaret quit drinking and went on to remarry. In a 1988 interview, Margaret indicated that she was still hopeful that Scott and Amy were alive and would return to her one day. Conversely, Roger was less hopeful, asserting that Scott would have gotten in touch with him if he'd been able to. For reasons that are unclear, aside from the fact that the two men strongly disliked each other, Roger suspected that his uncle Herman had harmed Scott and Amy. Herman denied this, in turn casting suspicion on Roger himself. Investigators dug up Herman's yard, but the search yielded nothing. Was Roger involved? Authorities also considered Roger a person of interest for many years, but they eventually came to the conclusion that he wasn't involved in the disappearance of the Fandel children. Investigators had only rumors and little else to go on in this case. However, Margaret's brother Terry, as well as Herman, continued to think that Roger was behind it, despite the fact that there was no evidence to support that theory. Roger had a verifiable alibi that night in question, yet it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that he had someone else abduct the children, they argued. Years later, a woman who'd been dating Roger when Scott and Amy vanished allegedly asked Roger's uncle for $5,000 in exchange for telling him what really happened to the kids. Terry, for his part, believes that Amy is alive and living in either Alaska, Montana, or California. But how he arrived to this conclusion remains a mystery. Sadly, he thinks that Scott was killed shortly after his abduction. The Fandel cabin burned to the ground in 1980, but no other details about this are publicly available. To this day, no solid evidence in support of any theory has been recovered, and no one has ever been charged in connection with the bizarre disappearances of Scott and Amy Fandel, whose fate is still unknown. The 1984 disappearance of Lucinda Hewells and the imposter who came home. Lucinda Hewells disappeared in Tampa, Florida in October of 1984. She was 17 years old, married, and a mother of two. She had an infant daughter named Deanna and a son named Tony. Disappearance, October 26, 1984. On the night of October 26, 1984, Lucinda told her husband, Larry Hewells, that she was going to the laundromat. She left their home in Hillsborough County and was never seen by her family again. Later that evening, Lucinda was spotted with friends at the Char Pal Lounge, a bar in the 3700 block of East Bush Avenue in Tampa, near Busch Gardens. The tavern had a rough reputation and had once been tied to a 1970s mob extortion case involving Jimmy Hill, an incident that later inspired a scene referenced in the movie Goodfellas. The man with the job offer. Multiple witnesses later told investigators they saw Lucinda talking to a man who owned a sign-making business and was offering her a job. In the early morning hours of the next morning, police found that man and another individual asleep in a vehicle on the side of the road. Officers arrested them for marijuana possession and carrying a concealed weapon. At the time, Lucinda had not yet been reported missing, and she was not with them. Records show the sign business owner was questioned twice later, but he denied knowing anything about Lucinda's disappearance. It remains unclear whether he was ever formally considered or treated as a suspect. Police also questioned others at the bar. Everyone seemed to have a different recollection of who they had seen her leave with. The car, October 27, 1984. The next morning, Lucinda's car was found alone in the Char Pal Lounge parking lot. It was unlocked, and inside, investigators found a basket of clean, folded laundry. The keys were missing. The Busch Gardens discovery. A few days later, Lucinda's purse was discovered in a men's bathroom at the Busch Gardens Zoo campground. Inside it was cash, her driver's license, and oddly, her marriage certificate. At the time she vanished, Lucinda had been planning Tony's second birthday party. This fact made her family doubt she would ever willingly abandon her children. Possible serial killer connection. Because her disappearance happened during a wave of murders in the Tampa area, investigators consider the possibility that Lucinda had been a victim of serial killer Bobby Joe Long, who terrorized the region in 1984. Long was arrested 3 weeks after Lucinda vanished and eventually confessed to killing 10 women in Hillsborough County. He denied any involvement in her case. Years later, a reporter wrote to Long and asked about her disappearance. This was his response, quote, "I'm sorry to hear about the Hughes girl. Truly I am. And if you think you can help them by sharing this with them, please feel free to do so. I know nothing about that matter and had nothing to do with it. I don't lie. I don't have to. That's the truth of it. It's not a good feeling knowing how many people I've hurt, directly or indirectly. I wish I could help the Hewells family find closure, at least, but I can't. I have no knowledge of that matter. If I did, I'd tell them. I don't want to ever be the source or focus of people's pain again. End quote. Based on later articles, Lucinda's family does not believe she was the victim of Long. The phone call, April 1992. In April of 1992, Lucinda's 8-year-old daughter, Deanna Hewells, answered the phone after coming home from school. The woman on the line asked who she was. Deanna said her name. The caller replied, "Oh my goodness, my baby girl. This is your mother." Deanna had grown up seeing her mom's photo on the missing posters and had never heard her voice. She told the caller it wasn't funny, then put her grandma on the line. The woman told the family she had run away in 1984, overwhelmed by the pressures of marriage and motherhood at such a young age. According to a newspaper report from the time, she claimed she had hitched a ride from Tampa along I-275, lived in Memphis for a while, gotten a job working as a waitress at a hamburger stand in Memphis, using the name Amanda, and eventually moved to Arkansas. When Lucinda's husband Larry was interviewed by a TV reporter about the news, he said he wasn't focused on the reasons she had left. He was simply relieved and glad she was okay. The homecoming. At first glance, the resemblance was striking. The woman looked exactly like Lucinda, but appeared not to have aged much at all. The gap that had once been in Lucinda's front teeth was gone, which the woman explained by saying she had her teeth fixed. She also said she had undergone jaw reconstruction after a car accident. For many in the family, the emotional pull was powerful. Lucinda's son, Tony, who was 10 years old at the time, remembered feeling an immediate bond with her. But some people close to Lucinda weren't convinced. Her brother, Ricky Malden, immediately felt something was wrong when he saw her. Still, he kept those doubts to himself because their mother was overjoyed to believe her daughter had finally come home. Lucinda's childhood friend, Candy Lesarge, also sensed something wasn't right the moment they met. During the first visit, the two women looked through an old photo album together. The woman seemed to recognize several of the people and events in the photos. Lesarge later wondered how she could have known those details. Had this woman, who didn't seem to be Lucinda, somehow seen the album before? Despite the doubts, the family wanted to believe. The woman moved into the Hewells' home and began living with them as Lucinda. At the same time, newspapers across the South began running stories about the missing woman who had returned home after almost 8 years. Amanda, the Arkansas investigation. The story began to unravel in Springdale, Arkansas, where a local detective named Waylon Stepp had already been looking into a woman named Amanda. Amanda's husband, Danny Fletcher, had grown suspicious of her. When they first talked of marriage, he asked her to get a copy of her birth certificate. Amanda didn't want to. She stalled. She refused to talk about her past, wouldn't discuss her family, and had no photos of them. She didn't want her photograph taken either. Danny knew she was hiding something, but couldn't figure out what. According to reports at the time, someone told Danny they had seen a woman who looked just like Amanda on the TV series Unsolved Mysteries. Note, the broadcast later denied ever airing Lucinda's story. Danny's mother, Amanda's mother-in-law, was also growing suspicious. She began calling toll-free hotlines for missing children, seeking any information that fit Amanda's description. The Missing Children Help Center in Tampa sent photographs of Lucinda Hewells in the mail. Danny and his mom believed it matched Amanda. Danny thought, "That's my wife." He confronted Amanda. She denied it. It's unclear exactly how, but the information wound up with authorities in Arkansas, who then obtained Lucinda Hewell's missing persons case file from Tampa. Amanda was brought in for questioning. During the meeting, Detective Stepp had Lucinda's case file on his desk, which included a photo and a description of a distinctive mark on Lucinda's leg. Stepp told the woman that if she didn't have the mark, the situation could be cleared up quickly. A female officer then examined the woman privately and confirmed she had a similar mark on her leg. When Stepp confronted Amanda with that information, the woman broke down and admitted she was Lucinda Hewells. She told Stepp through tears that she had run away years earlier. At the time, the confession seemed convincing enough that even Florida investigators initially believed the story. Post-reunion strange events: the car crash, the vandalized property, the slashed tires. In Tampa, the Hewells family began rebuilding their lives with the woman they believed was Lucinda. Then bizarre things started happening. The woman was involved in a car accident in which her car reportedly flipped into a ravine. She said someone in a white van had tried to run her off the road. Soon afterward, the Hewells' home was vandalized. The wrecked car in the driveway was spray painted with Strike 1. A shed behind the house was tagged Strike 2. The tires on the family vehicles were slashed. At first, some people worried that someone was trying to silence Lucinda. Detective Stepp later suggested another possibility: that the woman herself might have staged the incidents in an attempt to keep the family close and maintain the story. The other reunion. Months later, two people contacted police after seeing news stories about Lucinda's return. They believed the woman living with the Hewells family was actually their niece, Amanda, who had run away from home years earlier. By this point, Larry Hewells, Lucinda's husband, was having doubts the woman in his home was his wife. Police contacted Larry and told him about the development. A meeting was then arranged between the woman and the people claiming to be her relatives. In police reports, it was noted there was no signs of recognition between the woman and her supposed relatives. The woman denied being Amanda and insisted she was Lucinda. September 1992, blood tests. Detectives ordered blood tests to settle the question once and for all. When the results came back, they had their answer. The woman was not Lucinda Hewells. Her real name was Amanda Dennis, and she had run away from her home as a teenager. She admitted who she was and apologized for the pain she had caused the Hewells family, saying she had grown to love the two children while living with them. Amanda left Tampa and returned to Arkansas. For Lucinda's family, the experience felt like losing her all over again. The aftermath. Lucinda's husband never remarried and rarely spoke about the case. Years later, Tony contacted Amanda through Facebook Messenger. He asked her two questions. Was she his mother? She said no. Did she ever know Lucinda? She said no, but added that she wished she had. Amanda apologized again for the pain she caused the family and said that she would answer any questions they had. The Hewells family says they hold no anger toward her, and thinks she may have been a lonely young woman searching for a family. The theory that Lucinda was killed by Bobby Joe Long remains possible but unproven. Her family does not believe she would have left her life and her children by choice. On November 17th of 2021, Lucinda's son, Tony, also disappeared. He was 38 years old. Note, according to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, he returned home. What happened to the real Lucinda? Despite the bizarre episode, the case remains unsolved. Lucinda was last seen at the Charpow Lounge, and witnesses told investigators she was talking to a man offering her a job. Her car, laundry, and purse were found. To this day, nobody knows what happened to her. The questions. What do you think really happened to Lucinda Hewells? How did Amanda know so many personal details about Lucinda's family? Could they have moved through the same hitchhiking routes or underground transient communities at some point? And if Amanda really did encounter Lucinda somewhere along the way, what made her decide to step into Lucinda's life and claim that identity as her own? If Lucinda was murdered, what are your theories about how Amanda learned all this information? And why do you think Amanda initially denied being Lucinda to her husband and mother-in-law, then admitted to being Lucinda? What other questions or theories do you have about this case? Trio of Baltimore missing persons. It's one thing for a person to go missing. It's another thing entirely for a multi-ton hunk of metal to vanish without a trace. Often, the most likely outcome when this occurs is that both the individual and their vehicle ended up in a body of water somewhere. This isn't uncommon in Baltimore. In July of 2025, an entire minivan and a human body were recovered from the Inner Harbor after Baltimore police divers discovered it during a training exercise. The van had been missing since 2014, and to anyone's knowledge, the body has not yet been identified. I have 3 cases, and all 3 involve Baltimore residents who vanished with their vehicles, and neither the people nor the vehicles have been found in any of the cases. What's been striking is the limited information available in all 3 cases. For each one, only brief blurbs on the Charlie Project and Name Us, as well as the singular missing person poster from the BPD, and 1 news article. Here are those 3 cases in chronological order. James Allen Harris. James Allen Harris was a 31-year-old black man who vanished on March 8th of 1996. He was last seen at his home on the 300 block of Font Hill Avenue in West Baltimore. James left his house for his shift at the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center on Friday, March 8, 1996. During an 8-hour period through the morning of March 8th, a snowstorm dumped 4 to 5 inches of snow on central Maryland, including Baltimore. It was likely snowing when James left his home for his shift that morning. He departed dressed in the trademark pink scrubs of shock trauma, brown boots, a leather jacket, and had on a gold watch and a necklace. His car was a cream or silver 1992 Infiniti with Maryland plates CRH 468. His workplace was only about 2.5 miles away, a 10 to 15 minute drive depending on traffic and good weather. But James never arrived. Neither he nor his car has been seen since. What's striking in this case is that James left heading to a specific location not far from his house, unless he traveled significantly out of his way. There are no major bodies of water deep enough to conceal a car between his residence and his work. He was dressed in a manner that would make him instantly recognizable as a healthcare worker, but would provide little protection from the elements. There were no known locations in any contemporary news articles or police reports from the time of his disappearance. James has been missing for 30 years. If he is alive, he would be 61 years old today. Where could he have gone between his home and work during a snowstorm? Case number 2, Juanita Michelle Nicholson. Juanita Michelle Nicholson was a 47-year-old Black woman who went missing on November 6th of 2006. She was last seen in the 3000 block of Lewina Road in West Baltimore, wearing a light brown suede jacket and light blue jeans. Her vehicle, a green 2001 Dodge Neon with Maryland plates LHL 762, has also never been recovered. She was known to wear wireframe glasses, and in every photo found of her from 2006, she is spotted wearing medium-sized gold hoop earrings. There is very little else available for her case. A Reddit post from 7 years ago regarded 3 skeletons found in and around a construction site at the base of an apartment building. All 3 bodies were eventually identified as Black women between the ages of 41 and 48, and all 3 were homicides. All 3 women went missing between April and December of 2006. Posters in that thread mentioned that this could be the work of a serial killer, and if so, Juanita matches the general geographic area and time frame where the others were killed. Note, those remains were in D.C., not Baltimore, though the time frame aligns. Juanita was 47 years old when she went missing. If she were alive today, she would be 66 years old. Could she have fallen victim to a serial killer? Case number 3, Kenyon Anthony McLean. Kenyon Anthony McLean was a 35-year-old Black man who disappeared on March 12, 2011. He was last seen in the 2100 block of Bryant Avenue in Baltimore at 5:30 p.m., wearing a black blazer, black and red shirt, black Nike boots, and a black bandana on his head. He had spoken to his girlfriend earlier that day and told her that he was at their apartment in southwest Baltimore. However, when she arrived at the apartment, he wasn't there. It is also stated by some sources that Kenyon didn't show up for work on March 12th. His vehicle is described as a 2003 Chrysler Concorde 4S with Maryland plates 5ACO 322. Neither he nor the car have been seen since. There is very little information available in this case, but it's important to note that the short route between his apartment on Stonecroft Road in southwest Baltimore and his last seen location near Mondawmin Mall does not take you directly past any significant bodies of water. However, there are a pair of small lakes near where he was last seen. The larger Druid Lake and the smaller Lake Ashburton, both of which are large enough to potentially conceal a vehicle. That being said, at some point recently, Lake Ashburton was drained for work on the reservoir. Kenyon disappeared when he was 35 years old. If he were alive today, he would be 50 years of age. What do you think? Could he have ended up in one of those lakes or reservoirs? Stephen Clark. Vanished from a public restroom? A 23-year-old man vanishes under mysterious circumstances, leaving not a shred of evidence behind. Mystery at a seaside restroom. On the afternoon of December 28, 1992, 23-year-old Stephen Clark went for a walk with his mother, Doris. They made what was meant to be a brief stop at a public restroom in Saltburn, England, before returning home. According to Doris, she last saw her son entering the men's room, but when she exited the ladies' room just minutes later, he was already gone. More than 30 years have passed with no answers and no signs of Stephen. What really happened to Stephen Clark? Stephen Charles Clark. One of the two children, Stephen Charles Clark, was born on August 30th, 1969, in Colchester, Essex, England, to parents Charles and Doris, who had both served as police officers. Stephen was in a terrible accident when he was only 2 years old. Doris left the family home to go shopping one day when, unbeknownst to her, Stephen found his way out of the house and had started to follow her. She didn't become aware of this fact until she heard a commotion and saw that her son had been hit by a truck. It's unclear whether or not anyone else was at home watching Stephen that day. Sadly, he spent a month in a coma and was left with a permanently damaged arm and a pronounced limp. Despite his early misfortune, Stephen grew up to be a funny, intelligent, and genuinely happy person who loved music, bowling, and hanging out at the local pub. He also enjoyed swimming and had an avid interest in computers. Stephen and his sister Victoria grew up in South Africa, but the Clark family eventually returned to England and settled in Marske-by-the-Sea in 1990. He attended the Rathbone Society, an organization in Radcar that assists disabled individuals in finding employment. He worked hard and excelled in his studies, even earning an award for Apprentice of the Year. His achievements notwithstanding, he found the employers often hesitated to give him a chance due to his disability, and his limitations sometimes got him down. Saturday football. Stephen and his father Charles enjoyed attending football games together, usually on Saturdays. Charles often purchased tickets for them both, but for unknown reasons, he refused to buy Stephen a ticket to the local Middlesbrough match on December 28, 1992, telling him that if he wanted to attend, he'd have to pay for his own ticket. According to Doris and Charles, it was a running joke in the family that Stephen didn't like to pay for anything with his own money. He ultimately opted not to go to the game with his father. Doris and Stephen's last walk together. Charles left home at approximately 2 p.m. on December 28th to drive the 10 miles to the stadium, where Middlesbrough would be playing against Crystal Palace. After he departed, Doris and Stephen decided to take a long walk together on the nearby beach in Saltburn. According to Doris, as they were heading back, Stephen told her he needed to use the restroom. They stopped at a public restroom near the seafront pier of the promenade, located roughly 3 miles away from their home. Doris went into the women's room shortly after her son went into the men's. When Doris came out a few minutes later, she didn't see Stephen anywhere. Assuming he was still in the bathroom, she waited outside the door for several minutes before coming to the conclusion that he might have left already and started walking home without her. Thinking she'd catch up with him along the way, she headed back to the Clark's residence on her own. However, she never spotted her son at any point during this walk, and when she arrived home, she found it empty. Strangely, there was no sign of Stephen anywhere. When asked later why she didn't go into the bathroom to see if her son was all right or to at least confirm that he wasn't in there anymore, she explained, "He would have been horrified. He was 23 years old, not a child." Stephen is gone. It's unknown exactly when Charles got back from the game, but it was sometime after that Doris realized their son was missing. She told him what had happened, and the couple immediately went out to look for him. "I got my car to Saltburn, went all over the place screaming. 28 years, we never heard a word," explained Charles in 2020. Stephen, who was described as being 6'3" with a medium build, blue eyes, and dark brown hair, was last seen wearing a maroon crew neck jumper and a navy blue parka with a fur hood, blue denim jeans, and gray trainers. After a fruitless search, they knew it was time to get the police involved. They reported Stephen missing at 6 p.m. that evening. Doris let them know that she'd witnessed two men with a little girl enter the restroom right after Stephen did. These people have never been identified or located. In fact, no one has ever came forward to corroborate Doris's story that she and Stephen were there that day. Nevertheless, the authorities, much like the Clarks, came up with nothing during their search. Not a shred of evidence was discovered that would explain what had happened to Stephen Clark that afternoon. Alleged sightings. In the days and weeks following Stephen's disappearance, several sightings were reported to investigators. A witness who knew Stephen placed him near the Clark house at approximately 3:45 p.m. on the day he went missing. A woman claimed to have seen Stephen from her apartment window 2 days after he vanished. According to her, he was leaving the beach in the company of an older man wearing glasses. However, the police were skeptical of her story. Given the distance between her living room window and the area where the two men were allegedly seen, it was unlikely that she would have gotten a clear enough view of Stephen to identify him. It's unknown if she owned a pair of binoculars. On January 4th, 1993, Stan Camish, a friend of Clark's, supposedly saw Stephen in red car, less than 10 miles away from Saltburn. He said that he spoke to Stephen, but didn't think anything of the encounter because he wasn't yet aware that the young man had been reported missing. Interestingly, Stan changed his story years later, confessing that he not only didn't talk to Stephen Clark that day, but the man who spotted wasn't really Stephen, rather someone who merely resembled him. Why he initially lied remains a mystery, and Stan has since passed away. Ultimately, none of the reported sightings could be verified, and with no leads or viable suspects to work with, the case quickly went cold. Additional information. All of Stephen's personal belongings, including his glasses, watch, and wallet, were left behind. Neither his bank account nor his savings account were ever touched following his disappearance. He never claimed his £1,000 reward money for his Apprentice of the Year prize. Anonymous letter leads to shocking alert. In 1999, investigators received an anonymous letter that made shocking claims about the true fate of the missing man. Detective Chief Inspector Sean Page described the contents, quote, "The letter was very precise in nature. The letter writer intimated that Stephen was dead and that they claimed to know the person responsible. The full contents of this letter were never released to the public. In fact, the existence of the letter was unknown to the public until 2020, when it was finally released in a heavily redacted form. That same year, the case was suddenly reclassified as a murder investigation. Evidently, the author of the letter implicated Charles and Doris in the alleged murder of their son. Following a cold case review by the Cleveland police in September of 2020, the couple was arrested. If the letter was the catalyst for probable cause and arrest, and it appears it was, it's unclear why law enforcement waited so many years to make an arrest. The woman who wrote the letter, whose identity was never revealed, eventually came forward, but she was unable to produce any evidence of the Clarks' guilt. Doris and Charles were released on bail. An extensive forensic search was conducted in the Clark home, as well as their backyard, garden, and nearby wooded area, but police found nothing relevant to the case. In February 2021, after a grueling 17-week investigation, Doris and Charles were officially cleared of suspicion in their son's disappearance. Accused of murdering our son documentary. The couple's ordeal was explored in a documentary entitled Accused of Murdering Our Son, the Stephen Clark Story, which featured the Clarks' interaction with former police officer turned investigative journalist Mark Williams Thomas. Williams Thomas concluded, quote, "If Charles and Doris killed Stephen, then they're the best actors I've ever met. I don't think they killed Stephen." However, a review by The Guardian stated, even as William Thomas proclaims their innocence, certain framing and editing choices subtly undermined him, allowing the film to have it both ways. The family speaks out. After decades of silence, Stephen Clark's sister, Victoria Orr, spoke to the Missing podcast and defended her parents. Our relationship as a family was love-filled. Stephen and I couldn't have wished for a happier childhood, Victoria recalled. Stephen going missing has been a living nightmare on all of us, she added. Victoria said there was no way her parents would ever hurt Stephen and criticized the police for relying on the anonymous letter. I mean, the letter was even addressed to the wrong police force. The name was wrong. It went to a different police force in Geesboro, which is not the police that we're dealing with. So why it was taken so seriously, I really don't know, but it has devastated our family, she said. It was just awful. The way they were treated was diabolical. Victoria said the Clarks were filing a formal complaint against the police through their solicitor. Was Stephen dating someone? According to Doris and Charles, Stephen was dating a girl he met at a local pub, the Ship Inn, prior to his disappearance. This relationship with the girl lasted about a week or 10 days, Charles said. He liked to go to the local pub. He was there. They were about the same age. They never met other than at the pub. It was days before he went missing. It was not a serious girlfriend. He had not had a serious one. We lived in South Africa, then near London before he came here. Neither parent believed this relationship was related in any way to their son going missing. The Clarks also noted that Stephen's behavior appeared to be normal, both on and leading up to December 28th, and that there was no family strife or other problems as far as they knew. The family released a joint statement in 2022. The constant painful limbo of not knowing is a horrible thing to live with. We still hope that he will walk through the door one day, but we appreciate that as each year passes, it becomes more and more unlikely. What happened? Detective Mark Williams referred to the case as one of the most bizarre he's ever investigated. Detective Chief Inspector Sean Page said that there are no active lines of inquiry currently, but that they continue to respond to any intelligence and information which may help us locate Stephen. The Cleveland and North Yorkshire police indicated that they believe Stephen was in a relationship with a girl he'd met at the Rathbone Society at the time of his disappearance. It's unclear if there was any significance attached to this piece of information. Aside from his parents, no other suspects have ever been identified in Stephen's case. Theories for why he vanished include suicide, abduction, murder, and leaving to start a new life. But to this day, nothing substantial has ever been discovered to lend credence to any of them. What happened to 23-year-old Stephen Clark during the brief window of time on that afternoon of December 28th of 1992? For now, at least, that remains unknown. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to the Unsolved. I'd like to acknowledge the rest of the membership of BackToAshes. Thank you all so much for continuing to hold the channel up and your dedication and love. Please know that from the bottom of my heart, I truly, deeply appreciate it. I cannot say thank you enough. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you kindly. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed these collections. In the meantime, please stay vigilant and take care of yourselves. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourselves a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.